So for our deep dive today, we're going to be looking at something that, well, it's one of the most famous teachings of Jesus,
Mm,
but it's also, one of the most profoundly challenging. I'm talking about the instruction to give in secret.
right, from the Sermon on the Mount.
Exactly. Matthew chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. It's a teaching that it feels like it cuts right across every human impulse toward, being seen.
It really does, and that's a
Yeah.
perfect way to frame it. We're looking at an essay today that treats this not as some simple rule about technique,
Right.
but as a really rigorous lifelong discipline of the heart. For any thoughtful Christian, this passage forces you to confront the core question of your spiritual life. Who really is your ultimate audience?
And that's our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To really clarify what Jesus means by this radical secrecy. We need to dissect why avoiding the desire for applause is so critical
Hmm.
and how we can shift our focus entirely to what the source material calls the audience of one.
Mhm.
I think it's so easy to agree with that idea intellectually,
Oh, absolutely.
but the moment you try to live it, you realize just how countercultural and even counterintuitive it is.
It is intensely difficult, and Jesus knew that. That's why he sets the stage immediately, not with a command, actually, but with a powerful warning.
In Matthew 6, verse 1.
Exactly. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. That first phrase, be careful, that's the signal. It tells you that the drift toward performance is constant. It's a default setting.
And he applies it to everything: giving, prayer, fasting.
The three pillars of piety at the time. He's covering all the bases of visible religion.
What stands out to me is just how brutally honest he is about the reward structure. I mean, the essay we're looking at doesn't just call human applause poor, it calls it a fragile god. Why that language? Why describe it in such devastating, almost spiritual terms?
Because it's fundamentally an act of misplaced worship. That's the key.
Yeah.
When our giving or our devotion is performed mainly to get that recognition from people, we're essentially treating their opinion as our source of ultimate validation. And Jesus' verdict on that is that it's worthless. Matthew 6.2 says it plainly. When you get that applause, you've already received your reward.
You've cashed out.
You've cashed out. And spiritually speaking, the check bounced.
The kingdom's economy, then, it's operating on a completely different system.
Completely. The kingdom's way is quiet mercy. It's about work done exclusively for the satisfaction of knowing that the Father sees and, trusting that his smile is a sufficient reward.
Now, we have to address the tension here right away because I know our listener is thinking about it. Just a few verses earlier, in Matthew 5.16, Jesus says, "Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven."
The classic perceived contradiction.
Right. How do you hold those two things together? Shine your light, but do your righteousness in secret.
And that specificity is so important. The essay we're drawing from really addresses this head on. The point is that Matthew 6 is not a ban on all public good. It's a summons to pure motives. So if your light shines, if your church's food drive or your public act of service leads people to glorify the Father, then you're perfectly aligned with Matthew 5. But if your motivation is subtly twisted, if the result is that people end up glorifying you, the doer, then you've inverted the entire goal, and you fall right under the warning of Matthew 6.
So the action from the outside could look identical.
Identical.
But it's the internal GPS of the heart that determines whether it's an act of worship or just self-promotion.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's all about the interior landscape of the soul. We're called to be a people who are, at our core, trusting the God who sees in secret. And, the source material powerfully connects this to the idea that God weighs not just the gift.
But the reason it left your hand.
Exactly. That's a deep scriptural echo, right? It goes all the way back to Proverbs 16.2, where the Lord weighs the motives, even when our own ways seem innocent to us.
Wow. That insight alone is a real aha moment. It moves giving from just, a matter of external compliance to a kind of internal audit.
Spiritual audit, yes.
So as we get into this deep dive, the big question we're asking is this: what does it truly look like to give for the audience of one? And how do we make sure our motive can survive that kind of divine audit? So let's start by grounding this in the history of it all. So to really appreciate how sharp Jesus's critique was, we first have to understand that this idea of caring for the poor, it wasn't new, it was ancient in Israel.
Absolutely. Righteousness in the Old Testament scriptures was never just a theological belief system. It was always concrete. It meant practical care.
Right.
It was just foundational to what it meant to be God's people.
And when you look at the law, the commands are just so uncompromising. I'm thinking of Deuteronomy 15, where it instructs them to open their hands wide to their needy brother.
Hmm.
And it promises a blessing on that generosity. This wasn't framed as, optional charity. It was an expression of their identity as a redeemed people. They were not supposed to be hard-hearted or tight-fisted.
And it wasn't just an isolated duty. This is what's so fascinating.
Mhm.
The law embedded compassion deep into the everyday structures of their society, especially agriculture.
And this is where the gleaning system comes in from Leviticus 19.
Exactly. This surprising detail of agricultural mercy.
So tell us more about that. I mean, the whole idea seems so counterintuitive to our modern ideas of efficiency and maximizing yield. How did gleaning actually work to give dignity and not just, leftovers?
It was a beautiful act of, let's call it institutionalized compassion. Landowners were commanded not to harvest all the way to the corners of their fields,
Okay.
and they weren't supposed to go back and pick up everything that had fallen. Essentially, the law mandated a kind of inefficiency in their system. And this reserved resource was specifically for the poor and for the foreigner.
So the poor weren't just begging for a handout.
Yo.
They were using a right that was granted to them by God's law. They were working for what they gathered.
Exactly right. It ensured that compassion was built into the very rhythm of farming and the economy. The poor could gather with dignity because they were, in a sense, following up on the landowner's labor, not just waiting for an occasional gift. It forced the wealthy to constantly reflect God's own generous character right in the middle of their daily work.
That historical context really sets the stage for the critique of performance that Jesus delivers.
It does, because by the first century, giving, or alms, was one of the three most visible markers of piety, right alongside prayer and fasting. It was just expected. If you were a devout Jew, you did these three things.
So the problem Jesus had wasn't with the practice itself.
No, not at all. It was the performance. He critiques the motivation that turns an act of mercy into a tool for, as the essay says, harvesting honor from onlookers in the public square.
And religious leaders at the time were known for these sorts of loud displays of piety, right?
Very much so. Making sure they were seen giving or praying at just the right time in just the right place.
And then we get this famous visceral language about blowing trumpets in Matthew 6.2. Now, was this a literal thing, or is this just vivid exaggeration?
The scholarly consensus really leans toward hyperbole.
Okay.
The essay suggests it's a kind of playful, intentional exaggeration, a vivid literary device meant to unmask the internal showiness. It's the ancient equivalent of saying, drawing attention to yourself with a giant neon sign.
Right.
Jesus uses this image of a trumpet to basically mock mercy that has been turned into marketing, where the needy person is just a prop for the giver's ego.
And the consequence for this spiritual marketing,
Yeah.
is that the goal is completely self-defeating.
Fundamentally self-defeating. If the reward you're seeking is human honor, you get it, and that is the end of the story.
It's a tragic trade-off.
It's a terrible trade. Matthew 6.2 is absolute. You have already spent your reward. The pursuit of external reputation is an immediate payment, but it's an empty one. The value of human praise is so fleeting, so finite. If your heart is set on reputation, the Father isn't impressed because you've chosen the temporary, fragile praise of man over the enduring, eternal praise that comes from Him.
Which leads us right to the core instruction. Secrecy as a spiritual discipline. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. This feels deeper than just, external anonymity. It pushes that secrecy even into our internal dialogue.
That is the crucial depth of this discipline. It's a command against self-congratulation. It demands that we should avoid even rehearsing the gift in private, preventing ourselves from setting up a private parade of virtue in our own minds.
But why? Why is that required?
Because self-congratulation is so profoundly corrosive.
Yeah.
It turns the act of mercy from a gift for the needy into a trophy for the self. The moment we start celebrating our own holiness, we're actually stealing glory from the God who enabled the act in the first place.
So the goal is to cultivate a reflex of mercy that literally slips past our own ego.
Yes.
The focus has to be solely on the neighbor's genuine need and just believing that the Father's eye and His pleasure is, that it's completely and utterly enough.
And this commitment to radical secrecy, it moves generosity entirely onto what the source calls the divine ledger. When we give in secret, we're activating the promise of Proverbs 19.17. Those who are kind to the poor lend to the Lord. This transaction is taken out of the court of public opinion where it can be misinterpreted or forgotten, and it's transferred into a divine economy where grace is recorded and remembered by God Himself. That ledger is incorruptible.
That idea, the divine ledger, that provides a really tangible security for you as a believer, doesn't it? You don't have to worry about whether your good deed was seen because you know the one who's seeing truly matters. Saw it.
Exactly. It frees us from that anxious need for validation. It ensures that unseen mercy is never, ever wasted mercy.
Now, let's pause for a moment and just address the framework that the essay provides, which helps clarify the scope of this command. Jesus is addressing Israel in a theocratic setting, and we know that a lot of the civil and ceremonial structures shifted radically after the cross. Does that change the moral requirement for us today?
That's a key question. The moral continuity absolutely remains, but you could argue the intensity is actually heightened.
Oh, interesting.
While the external framework changes, we're not bound by the civil code of ancient Israel. We're now operating under what Paul calls the law of Christ. The moral center intensifies because the focus shifts from just external compliance to an internal transformation that's worked by the Holy Spirit.
Can you elaborate on that? How does the Spirit change the game here?
Well, under the Old Covenant, the law commanded actions. But under the New Covenant, the Spirit is at work writing God's will directly on the heart, just as Jeremiah 31 promised. This means the expectation for purity of motive, for depth of love, is actually sharper. The church is meant to be this Spirit-formed people, known for a practical, sacrificial love that doesn't need a public stage. This fulfills Jesus' new command in John 13, that the world should know his disciples by their love. So the motive of secret generosity becomes even more crucial, regardless of the covenantal structure.
So the mandate to care hasn't been softened at all. If anything, the call to purity of motivation has been sharpened by the Spirit. That's essential context for the rest of our discussion.
So moving from history to the biblical narrative, it's just vital to ground all of this in the character of God himself. Generosity isn't a human invention or, some social program. It is rooted in God the Creator, who delights to give.
The New Testament captures that so beautifully. I'm thinking of James 1:17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights. He's the ultimate source of all giving, the initiator of all goodness. Our generosity is always, always a responsive, secondary action.
And Israel was constantly reminded that they were called to reflect this character. They had tasted unearned kindness. They were slaves, redeemed from Egypt, strangers in a strange land whom God delivered through pure, unmerited grace.
So they were commanded to mirror that mercy.
Exactly. To mirror God's mercy toward the poor, the sojourner, the stranger. This reflection of divine mercy, active, concrete, ongoing, was central to their righteous identity. You see it in Psalm 1 and 12, which notes the righteous person scatters gifts to the poor.
This helps us see that Jesus' critique, then, isn't some isolated teaching. He's standing firmly in that powerful prophetic tradition that exposed outward show without any inward compassion. This critique had been running for centuries.
For centuries. Take Isaiah 58. God's people were observing the formal rituals of fasting. They were bowing their heads, wearing sackcloth, looking very pious. But God rejected it. He asks, "Is this the kind of fast I have chosen?"
Because at the same time, they were oppressing their workers and ignoring the desperate needs all around them.
Exactly. The critique wasn't that the rituals themselves were bad, but that the motives were completely corrupt. They were seeking divine approval through outward acts while actively practicing injustice.
And so what was the fast God did choose?
Isaiah called them to loose the chains of injustice, to share food with the hungry, to provide shelter for the poor wanderer, clothe the naked. And the promise was beautiful. If you do that, your light will break forth like the dawn. It was a call for genuine compassion that led to undeniable, practical care for others.
We see that same stream of thought in the prophet Amos, too. He condemned the loud, celebratory religious music and festivals.
Because, again, they were drowning out the cry of the poor and the marginalized. Amos demanded that justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Jesus' warning in Matthew 6 just carries that same prophetic stream forward, insisting that the life of the kingdom cannot tolerate mercy that is simply used as a platform for vanity.
And Jesus himself, of course, provided the ultimate example of this redefined generosity. Let's zoom in on the story of the widow's mite. That story is just a perfect contrast to the showy giving Jesus condemns.
It's one of the most poignant moments in the Gospels. Jesus is watching the treasury box in the temple. The rich are dropping in large amounts of money, and they're doing it visibly and audibly.
Right.
They're giving out of their surplus, maximizing their own reputation in the process. And then a poor widow comes and drops in 2 small copper coins, the smallest denomination available.
And Jesus immediately calls attention to her, contrasting her action with the visible giving of the wealthy.
And his verdict is just startling. He judged the gift not by its financial noise or its numeric value, but by the measure of faith and love it represented. She gave out of her deep poverty everything she had. She had no audience but God, and her motive was pure. The lesson is just crystal clear. God measures the heart of the giver, not the size of the gift.
And the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25 is just as compelling, illustrating that idea of secret mercy. The righteous people in the story, they performed all this kindness, feeding, clothing, visiting.
But they were genuinely surprised when the king pointed it out.
That's the part that always gets me. They're surprised.
That surprise is the profound theological point. The righteous weren't tracking their good deeds. They didn't have a resume line of good works they were keeping. They simply acted instinctively out of compassion. Their giving was so deeply ingrained, so utterly selfless, that they had forgotten the actions entirely. And yet, heaven recorded every single act with joy.
And this ethic it explodes into the life of the early church. The source material highlights a really radical, practical commitment to this principle.
Oh yes, in Acts 2 and Acts 4, you see the believers selling possessions and property, laying the funds at the apostles' feet to be redistributed. And the explicit goal, Acts 4 tells us, was that there were no needy persons among them.
That wasn't just social idealism then.
Not at all. It was a tangible echo of the economic ideal, stated way back in Deuteronomy 15, now made possible by the unified, generous spirit of the church.
And we even see that divine ledger concept reinforced in the story of Cornelius, the Gentile centurion.
We do. His prayers and his gifts to the poor came up as a memorial offering before God. This confirms that God sees and remembers what the earth might forget. That secret cross-cultural generosity, it rises like incense in the court of the king.
So Paul then takes this profound narrative foundation and turns it into specific, systematic instructions for the Gentile believers in all these new churches.
Right. Paul's teaching is so systematic because it has to address the practicalities of communal life. He told the believers to set aside gifts regularly on the first day of the week,
Which transforms giving from just an impulsive reaction
into a planned, disciplined rhythm of life. And that planning helps remove the motivation for performance because the decision to give is made privately and systematically, not publicly when a need is, dramatized.
He also focused so intensely on the attitude of the giver.
Absolutely. He framed generosity not as a duty you do under compulsion, but as a joyful privilege. God loves a cheerful giver, he says in 2 Corinthians. The root of that Greek word for cheerful is hilaros. We get our word hilarious from it. The giving should be joyful, free, and abundant.
And that framing of generosity as sowing is one of the most powerful metaphors he uses. How does that connect to the idea of a silent reward?
It shifts the focus entirely away from the immediate transaction and onto God's faithfulness. Generosity is framed as a sowing action that will reap a harvest of righteousness. Not necessarily financial prosperity, but spiritual abundance, as God multiplies the seed sown. This assures you, the giver, that your investment isn't risky or wasteful. It's guaranteed to produce spiritual fruit under God's watchful care.
And finally, Paul had specific practical counsel for the wealthy. What was his instruction for them?
The pastoral epistles are very clear. Paul instructs the rich not to put their hope in uncertain wealth, but to be rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. To use their present resources strategically to lay up treasure for the coming age.
Which is a direct echo of Jesus' instruction in Matthew 6.
A direct echo. Investing in eternal value. Prioritizing the future life over temporary security. Paul is simply applying the principle of the audience of one to the investment portfolio.
So if we connect all of these threads, the history, the prophetic critique, the apostolic instruction, we start to see that Jesus' command to give in secret is, well, it's fundamentally about worship.
It is. It forces you to ask, who is my audience and what reward do I truly cherish in my life?
Let's unpack that idea of reward again. As we mentioned, Jesus uses that word frequently in Matthew 6. For the listener, it can sound a bit transactional, like a spiritual incentive program.
And we have to be careful not to diminish the profound theological redirection that Jesus is offering. His use of reward is not a crude enticement. It's an acknowledgement that we as humans are inherently hope-driven beings. We structure our whole lives around what we value, what we hope to gain, what we anticipate will satisfy us. Jesus doesn't eliminate that desire for reward. He radically redirects it.
So instead of aiming for that evaporating human honor, which you have to continuously earn and maintain,
Right.
We're told to aim for the Father's enduring pleasure.
Precisely. Human applause is temporary and it's fragile. It demands continuous attention and performance. But the Father's seeing and remembering is the true treasury because it's eternal, it's constant, and it's based on reality, not just reputation. Hebrews 11:6 reminds us that those who come to God must believe He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him.
So this reward is the satisfaction that our works of love are stored up where moth and rust can't destroy.
That's the treasury He's talking about.
This brings us to a really crucial theological safeguard. Does giving in secret ever risk becoming a kind of secret works righteousness? Are we just performing good deeds in the dark so we can score more points with God than the people who do them publicly?
It's a great question, and ironically, this very teaching acts as a guardian for the gospel itself. The essay makes it absolutely clear that grace always precedes generosity. Generosity is not the payment we make to God. It is the outflow of a heart that has already been changed by the staggering gift of the Son.
So the motivation has to be backward-looking, rooted in gratitude for what Christ has done, not forward-looking in expectation of earning some kind of merit.
Exactly. We give because God gave first. Paul puts it perfectly in 2 Corinthians 8:9. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. Our generosity is merely a mirror of that staggering free grace. Secret generosity, therefore, isn't a secret works righteousness. It's simply the evidence that the Holy Spirit is producing love in a heart that's already been made secure by grace.
We still need to confront that tension once more, though. The balance of public witness from Matthew 5 and radical secrecy from Matthew 6. How do you practically maintain that balance?
The key, again, is just to examine the fruit of the motive. Secrecy protects the humility of the doer. Public witness advances the glory of the Father. If a good deed draws attention to God's love and supply, it aligns with Matthew 5.
And if it draws attention to my sacrifice or my piety?
Then it falls into the warning of Matthew 6.
The early church narrative gives us a perfect case study here. Look at Barnabas. He sold a field, publicly laid the money at the apostles' feet, and it was celebrated. That public act spurred praise and reinforced trust in the community.
And then you contrast that immediately with the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. They sold property, but they secretly held a portion back while claiming they gave the whole amount.
And they were judged so harshly. Not for keeping the money.
No, Peter says they were free to do that. They were judged because they sought the reputation of Barnabas without the reality of his sacrifice.
Yeah.
They wanted the public honor.
So the deception in Acts 5 was rooted in seeking the public reward Jesus warned against. Their motive wasn't hidden generosity, it was calculated performance.
Precisely. That story highlights that the issue is always, fundamentally, motive before God. It's a constant, subtle balancing act that requires the Spirit's discerning eye.
Finally, let's talk about the eschatological horizon, the ultimate reward that makes this commitment to quietness possible. Why should that future promise outweigh the immediate gratification of recognition right now?
Because the future reward is enduring and incorruptible. The reward Jesus speaks of is primarily the well done from the judge at the seat of Christ.
Right.
Our works of love will be tested by fire, quiet gifts given for Christ's sake, long forgotten by everyone. They will endure and be honored there. Human praise, by contrast, is like wood, hay, and stubble. It just burns away instantly.
And that hope that heaven keeps better, more faithful books than we do is what truly frees us from the anxiety over recognition, doesn't it?
It does. You can perform difficult, thankless, unseen acts of service because you know the unseen God will one day bring every hidden thing into the light for praise. And his praise is the only one that truly deeply satisfies the soul.
Okay, so now we move from the theological bedrock to the really practical how-to part of this. And Jesus begins this whole section with that command, be careful, this discipline of carefulness. It's non-negotiable, isn't it?
It is, because the drift toward performance is constant, and it is strong.
And that drift is amplified, exponentially in our modern culture. We live in an age that almost demands total visibility. Social media has trained us to document everything, including our good deeds, so that likes and shares become the primary metric of worth.
Right. Our temptation toward self-promotion is almost involuntary at this point.
So the practical application has to begin with a really rigorous motive examination, both before and after we give.
Yes. We have to ruthlessly interrogate ourselves. And the acid test, as the source material highlights, is simple, but it is brutal. With this gift, this act of kindness, this volunteer work, Would it still happen if I could guarantee that absolutely no one would ever know but God?
That one question just cuts through all the sophisticated excuses we build up. And we have to examine our language, too. When we talk about a need or an outcome, does the narrative center on our sacrifice or on the grace of God that provided the means?
It requires deep, ongoing self-reflection. Kind of like the prayer in Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. See if there is any offensive way in me. If we find our heart loving the visibility more than it loves the person we're serving, we have to confess that, repent, and immediately adjust our behavior toward quietness.
So, how do we practically do that? How do we embody this radical secrecy, that left hand, right hand image, in a way that protects our motive?
The source material suggests intentional, anonymous design. We should establish forms of giving that are deliberately opaque, even to ourselves.
What does that look like?
Well, it might mean setting up automated recurring transfers to ministries you trust, where you no longer even track the specifics, or maybe using a third party to deliver assistance so that neither the recipient nor your future self can, polish the memory into a story that's centered on you.
I find that left hand, right hand picture suggests making quiet mercy a kind of second nature, like a reflex, a habit of giving that is so ingrained it just slips right past the internal ego.
It should be a constant rhythm, not a series of big events that we rehearse for our identity formation. It's the steady, quiet living out of Romans 12.13, practicing hospitality, sharing with those in need without feeling the need to announce it.
Now, secrecy on its own can lead to a sense of duty, which can feel heavy or begrudging. But Paul insists on a necessary pairing. Secrecy must be accompanied by cheerfulness.
That pairing is essential. Secrecy without joy can quickly become a form of legalism or grudging obligation.
Yeah.
Paul explicitly says in 2 Corinthians 9.7, God loves a cheerful giver. This cheerfulness is the sign that the heart is responding freely to grace, rather than fearfully to a rule.
So if your generosity feels heavy or transactional, that's a sign that you've probably temporarily lost the theological root of it all. The joy that should flow from knowing God is the ultimate provider and the ultimate rewarder.
Exactly. Cheerfulness rests securely on the promise that God is able to make all grace abound toward you, so that you'll have what you need to abound in every good work. Stinginess is so often born of fear, isn't it? Fear of lack, fear of future needs. The promise of God's supply in Philippians 4 frees us from that fear, and it enables us to be truly glad when we share what is already His.
We've focused a lot on financial giving, but this principle has to apply beyond just money. How does this heart of secrecy and sincerity expand into other areas of your life?
It applies universally to all acts of service,
Yeah.
your time, your attention, hospitality, advocacy, skills offered without fanfare. It applies to every area where you use your resources to serve others. The goal is what James calls pure religion, looking after orphans and widows in their distress and keeping oneself unstained by the world.
Which means the generosity of Matthew 6 can be lived out in thousands of quiet ways every week. I'm thinking of concrete examples, like the hours you spend mentoring a difficult student without ever mentioning it to your friends. Or a meal delivered to a single parent without taking a selfie or asking for public thanks. Or just consistently serving in the most thankless, unseen roles in your community or your church.
Those quiet, sustained acts, they bear the true shape of Matthew 6 because their purpose is solely for the benefit of the recipient and the eye of the Father. They are acts of humility that actively avoid the spotlight.
It seems counterintuitive, but planning can actually help with secrecy. If we're supposed to be almost impulsive and unself-conscious, why is intentionality so crucial?
Because planning turns that impulse into a sustainable rhythm. Just like Paul advised the Corinthians, setting aside funds regularly ensures that gifts are ready when needs arise. This pattern protects the motive because the decision to give is made when there's no pressing, public appeal, which avoids the temptation to only give when the visibility is high.
So intentionality is a kind of defense mechanism for the heart. Households can literally budget a line item for hidden mercy.
And that line item exists only for the Father's reward. It's an act of radical faith, trusting that God will show you the quiet, specific needs He wants to meet through your hands. It connects right back to the wisdom of Proverbs 3, honoring the Lord with the first fruits of your increase, often in ways that are deliberately unobserved.
Before we wrap up the application, we have to address the reality of human failure. We have all, at some point, paraded a gift. Or, on the other side, we've been tight-fisted and stingy.
We have to end this section with grace and warmth. Jesus' words are corrective to both performance and withholding, but the cross covers both of those failures. If we've sought applause, we confess that theft of glory, and we just begin again with a quiet gift, seeking only the Father's face.
And if we've been stingy, we repent and ask the Lord to enlarge our hearts, trusting that He is the one who can take hearts of stone and replace them with new, generous hearts, as promised in Ezekiel.
The Father who sees in secret also forgives in secret, and He leads us into those new patterns of generosity and joy. Hidden gifts are ultimately acts of worship that allow us to step into the family resemblance of the generous Father, the one who so loved the world that He gave His Son. When we give for His eye alone, we truly find satisfaction in the Father's smile.
Okay, so let's try to unpack the essence of this deep dive. Jesus reorients the giver first. The call is for a people who love mercy because they love the God of mercy, who treat their neighbor's need as holy ground, and who genuinely prefer the Father's quiet well done to the crowd's loud well said.
Mm.
It's the embodiment of walking humbly and loving mercy, just like Micah 6.8 commands.
That is the critical implication for our current age. In a culture where visibility is currency, where everything, even compassion, can be staged and monetized for clicks, the King calls us to the quiet, steady, cheerful, and radically Godward way of life.
And the encouragement here is that this quiet trust is entirely sufficient for a lifetime of ministry.
It is. The Father sees what is done in secret. He remembers it, He multiplies its fruit, and He rewards it with a joy that outlasts any headline or any human honor. Until that day when He brings every hidden thing into the light for praise, we are profoundly free to give without a trumpet, to serve without a stage, and to trust that the unseen God wastes nothing done for His name.
The central encouragement of this whole deep dive is that powerful promise that's attached to the command itself. So let's conclude by just anchoring ourselves one more time in that passage that launched our discussion.
The anchor for our hearts and our actions remains Matthew 6, verses 3 and 4. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. The profound encouragement there is the absolute promise of the Father's sure reward. And the necessary warning is that human honor is a poor, fragile substitute that will always, always steal our greater joy.
That's something for you to mull over, how you can budget for hidden mercy this week and whose applause you're truly seeking. May the Father who sees you in secret fill your heart with His own generous joy as you serve quietly today.